I got a tutorial about 2 years ago. My region here went through a devastating flood. They said the 1,000-year flood, but in these 4 counties, 46 people died. Thousands were left without homes. I think 1,400 people were rescued from the water. It was just, it was severe. And over again, these acts of sacrifice and common good. And that's democracy too, right?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Rural Impact. I'm Michelle Rathman, and I mean it when I say thank you so much for joining us for another conversation on a podcast that works hard to connect the dots between policy and rural everything. And welcome to our new set. It's wonderful to be here with you. Now, today is the third episode in our series about the 2024 election, and I'm actually recording this introduction today with you on Thursday, which is the last day of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And, you know, I think we can all agree these are some fascinating times to be sure, and it can be challenging to focus on policy, I think especially when mainstream media would much prefer us kind of stay fixated on personality. And that's one of the reasons why I am so excited about this episode and the guest that I'm going to introduce to you. And I'm sure many of you of our listeners out there know this name. And I'll just tell you this. He is the founder and president of the Center for Rural Strategies, a frequent contributor to the Daily Yonder. If you are not a subscriber yet of the Daily Yonder, I encourage you to do that today. And also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship. That is the one and only Mr. Dee Davis. And again, I'm so grateful that he's added his voice to this continuing courageous conversation. I did have an opportunity to interview Dee during an election year some time ago. And again, really just grateful for him joining me again. So without further delay, it's that time when I invite you to sit back, get yourself in your podcast headspace, and listen to my conversation with Mr. Dee Davis. Are you ready? I sure am. So let's go. Hey, Dee Davis, founder and president of the Center for Rural Strategies and a regular contributor. And I follow him there too on the Daily Yonder. Thank you so much for joining us, Dee. It's been a while, but I'm glad to have you on the Rural Impact.
It's nice to see you again, Michelle.
You too. You know, as I said, now this will be our third in our series called Courageous Conversations about the 2024 elections. And yes, I dare go there because I think it's good for us to have courageous conversations. It sure is better than screaming at each other over social media. So Dee, you know, we've talked around elections before. And if anyone's following my work, you have participated in many elections over the years. And I wonder if you would be so kind to share your wisdom and talk to our listeners about the stark differences you see in the 2024 election compared to the 2020, where rural is concerned. I don't think we need to go way, way back, but if we need to, we can do that too.
That's right. I think I was working elections as a teenager. I kept passing out cards, and I think shortly after I started to vote, I was named the Republican precinct captain and the head of the Young Democrats in the same election. So I thought that I've been around it. I haven't always been on top of it, but I've certainly seen a lot. And this one is a doozy, isn't it? So yeah, I think that you observe things, you have these rules, and then the rules change, right?
You're right.
For most of my life and the decades before, there was a coalition, a New Deal coalition that came out of inner city and rural voters coming together to put in New Deal Democrats. And they pretty much controlled things up until the Reagan era. And for 40 years, they controlled the House of Representatives until Gingrich got in during the Clinton administration. So at that point, the factor was urban and rural on one side and chiefly suburban on the other, as suburban population began to emerge. And now, whereas 100 years ago, half the country was rural, now it's maybe a fifth, and 60% of the country is suburban. So just those geographic shifts have changed the politics in major ways, and how each side gets into those constituencies, suburban, urban, rural, and metro, then that determines how the elections are going to come out. And Clinton and Gore were able to win the rural vote, barely, but they won that. And they had a strategy that included creating messages and policy that worked for rural. Then when Gore came, there was a shift in the political leadership and an idea that the changing demographics of the country were going to quickly affect elections. And so they began to concentrate more on metropolitan centers and moved away from investing in rural campaigning. And then that was a pretty much a razor thin or a tie election in 2000. And since then, you've seen different oscillation back and forth. But the rule always has been, since that time, that if Democrats compete, keep it fairly close in rural areas, then they win the presidential election. If they get shellacked, then they lose. The election can be close, but they'll lose. And then that changed slightly under Biden in 2020, when we saw up until the last election, the last week of the election, he was very close in rural, but then the voters moved toward Trump in that week. But he made up for it by flipping Trump voters in the suburbs, particularly white male voters in the suburbs who moved from Trump to Biden, and those are considered swing voters. And he was able to make a significant enough change to win those swing states.
Dee, I want to ask you, gosh, there's so many questions I want to ask you. And this next one I put out there because I think you teed it up perfectly. We are really good at compartmentalizing, rural, urban, suburban, white, non-white, what have you. And in April of this year, you authored a book review of something that enraged me as well, the white rural rage, the threat to American democracy. And your headline of this particular piece reads, "Book on Rural Rage is a grindstone in search of an axe. White rural rage is a smug misdirection of the threats to American democracy." Let's dive right into that, Dee, because again, what did the authors get wrong? And, why is it so dangerous for us to go down this path? Although we know that there are the numbers don't lie, there's percentages and whatnot, but to just classify all of this as white rural rage continues to be dangerous in my mind.
I was remembering this line from a John le Carré novel where they're in a rare bookstore and George Smiley reminds someone that Barabbas was a bookseller. I think that these guys needed to write this book, and I think they had like 8 stops, and most of what their premise was that there's this amazing, full of rage, white rural voter out there that's changing things. So it doesn't mean that they were never right, but it was also, Trump got 73 million votes in 2020 when he lost. If you write off 73 million voters as anti-democratic, it's very hard to have a democracy, right? If we're together because of just consent of the governed, then we've got to find strategies that bring people together. And I think there were several things they got wrong. One particularly is that most of the members of Congress that rural people vote for are urban or metro. They don't live in rural areas anyway. So to say that they are anti-cities when they're electing urban congressmen is a kind of one specious part of their premise. But I think that more than anything, it was just that they were interpreting things going wrong in rural, people being upset, everything is rage, and putting a racial filter on everything. Of course, this country, there's a lot of racism. There's racism in rural areas, but
we are recording this podcast on the 31st of July.
Right. And
racism alive and well. Sorry.
But what it does is it feeds into a kind of a meme that is circulate where people fear others, that they assume that people in rural areas who are not doing as well financially or are not getting the same jobs that the economy is creating, or not getting the same kind of health benefits, that they can be resentful. They can want to be part of a better outlook, but that doesn't mean that they're full of rage and they hate the country and they hate everyone. I think that what our polling and surveys showed is that really that rural voters wanted to be part of the whole country, that what they longed for was the time when they were fueling and feeding and taking care of everybody, and that they very much wanted to be part of it. And what the resentment we saw in what we were looking at was often anti-corporate people who were upset about the price of eggs, sure, but also the price of insulin, the price of gasoline, and they felt like nobody cared, that they were just superfluous to the American experiment. And I think that this was a recurring theme, that a lot of rural voters just felt left out.
And maybe even exploited just some, because you tap into it and you can expand it. And, so even behind my shoulder, I have the book, Unlike White Rural Rage. Political scientists Nicholas F. Jacobs and Daniel M. Shea gave us their book, The Rural Voter, The Politics of Place and the Disuniting of America. And they focused their work on helping readers really differentiate between politics of metropolitan, non-metropolitan places. And they did so by drawing from the largest survey, as I understand it, ever conducted, with a specific aim of understanding rural voters and the, as they say, rightward shift of American countryside. So what are your thoughts on this body of work in contrast to the book that we just spoke about?
I think that there's been some decisions made that the Democrats decided to focus on college-educated metro voters, and as they have moved in that direction, it's opened up some of their old-time supporters have moved to the right. And I was at a symposium that Nick and Dan held at Colby College in Maine, and I was interested. We see everything through the filter of Trump or through the views of the U.S. political dynamic. But one presenter showed that throughout Europe and Japan, Australia, the Western democracies, that this same kind of rightward move in rural areas has been occurring. So I think in every nation except Sweden, you had a demonstrable shift to the right in rural areas. And why is that? I'm not sure if those people feel left out or undervalued, if there is something in the air or the water. But what we see is a theme as we move, as globalization begins to really take hold, right? In the last 20 years, people in rural areas that used to farm or cut timber or mine have been replaced by the system, right? You need fewer people, or you don't need those jobs at all because they're competing globally. Well, it's shifted the dynamics in a lot of rural communities. And so I don't have a linear link to why this is happening, but I know that you juxtapose what's happening with global economies and what's happening in rural areas in this shift rightward.
Do you make me think of something? And this morning, and as I was preparing for this conversation, this came to mind. And so I just want to share this with you. For many, many years in the work that I do, I talk about the fact that as human beings, our behaviors are in large part, driven by how we feel. So we think certain things, we know certain things, and then we feel. And we act on things that we feel strongly about. What I find concerning is that we also say on this podcast, all roads to quality of life are paved by policy. And so I wonder if we could kind of shift the conversation to policies of both parties. And, I know once we get past, we are talking so much about big concepts like saving our democracy. At the end of the day, policies about roads and infrastructure, transportation, the food security, our healthcare systems in rural places, economic growth, access to capital. I wonder if you could kind of think about that for a moment and share how do we shift the conversation to talk about policy so that instead of basing our casting a vote based on how we feel about an emotional thing, but to really based it on informed knowledge. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think I do. I've been around for a minute, and I certainly worked in a number of campaigns in the things that mostly helping with media. And the thing I was always afraid to hear was someone say, well, the voters are with us on policy. The only thing worse than that was, if we can get our young voters out, we're going to win. Those are the two things. It's like, oh, no.
Note to self.
The reality is that the people usually pick a side, and then whatever that side is promoting as their policy, that's the policy they embrace. Now, so there are single issue voters, but there are not many of them. And people find different ways to rationalize. Once they put on a uniform, it's very hard for them to switch sides. But I think 2020, there was some lingering resentment about the way COVID was handled, and that's definitely a health policy, and that roiled the election, and it changed voters from one side to the other. I think that we've never really had a situation where democracy was on the ballot. We've had plenty of times when people said democracy's on the ballot, and
right.
People, it's like the little boy who cried wolf, over and over, ways to motivate people to come out. This is the existential, if we're going to keep the country off this. But, there are some truisms about democratic institutions that are stressed and strained, and right now, what that means in the coming election. And I think that oftentimes when we think of American democracy, we think of voters, we think of elections, how does that line up? But I got a tutorial about 2 years ago. My region here went through a devastating flood. They said the 1,000-year flood, but in these 4 counties, 46 people died. Thousands were left without home. I think 1,400 people were rescued from the water. It was just, it was severe. And so I live in a county that's probably 3-1 Democrat, voted 4-1 for Trump. And so that's one framework to think about it. But also another framework is people acting with courage, going through muck and water to save sick and shut in, taking their limited resources and sharing it with people who didn't have food, clothing, shelter. And over again, these acts of sacrifice and common good. And that's democracy too, right? It means democracy is not just I'm going to vote for mine. I'm going to take care of myself. I like this policy, and that's what I'm going to vote for. I don't want my taxes raised. I want more jobs. Those are important issues, but I think that there are some underlining fundamental foundational questions about democracy that we never really had on the line, and they may be showing themselves now. Do we listen to the courts? Do we respect legislation? When a term's over, is it over? I mean, there are some questions that we've never faced before, and we're getting ready to face them at a rapid speed.
Mm-hmm. All right. So with that said, Dee, because I look at, just carrying on that point, I just look at the notion that we would just eliminate so many jobs of civil servants. I think about all the work. I was just out in Oregon touring and we'll be doing a series on this, but I was just able to tour a brewery that received $1 million in grants to put solar panels up on their roof, and of course to improve efficiencies and so forth. And another project that just got they have approval for a FEMA brick grant to build a tsunami-resistant, earthquake-resistant rural healthcare facility. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm looking at. I mean, so when we think about what you just spoke up is very tangible, and so too are the investments and the policy that bears these investments. And knowing that we might not be able to get through, a policy conversation and have a really good, civil debate about it, let's just talk about words of wisdom that you can share about where to look for trustworthy information. Because it's easy to gloss these things over, especially if you are not consuming information that is accurate, that is depicting things in the reality base that we are living in. What information can you share with us about where folks can receive, rural voters, as they contemplate these real issues, where to look for trustworthy information, and what are the things to look for if they say if you could smell a fake, although you can't sometimes,
I mean,
right?
I think in some ways politics is cultural, right? That change is cultural. It's informed. I think Biden had the idea that policy could be cultural. It could be cool. We could emphasize policy shifts, and that sense of change would transform the way we think about politics. That's kind of what happened with the New Deal, and it's kind of what happened in the Great Society, right? That we had so much change that people embraced the change, and for a while, that change that transformed the culture in the country. And I think that was planned, but it was a plan built on a different framework, a longer term. So now there's a lot we don't know, right? We don't know. Certainly, Harris is an underdog. She's got a climbable hill, but it's a big hill, and it's been her job to talk about policy, but to talk about border jobs. But she's often talked about it. She's been the designated urban spokesperson, right? She's gone in to younger audiences and to urban audiences with the idea that President Biden would make the case to the others in the nation. And now it's her job to break through and to create a knowledge-centered policy conversation that people can feel culturally, feel in their hearts, and people who wake up thinking about going fishing, and people who wake up thinking about quilting and gardening. Those people need to feel connected to this policy discussion for it to resonate. If it doesn't resonate, if there's not some traction for people in rural communities, then it's going to make that hill a lot tougher to climb. So I think that it's early days, right? Yeah, I think we'll we'll know more in a month than we know right now.
Mm-hmm. And I want to remind our listeners, I mean, obviously we know this isn't just presidential politics, but obviously, I read something this morning by, I don't know if you follow Brian Castrucci, but, he wrote a piece and on social media this morning, he said life expectancy in the U.S. is the lowest it's been in nearly 2 decades. Candidates, how will you add years to our lives? And so you said something about kind of like post-COVID and so forth. I mean, these are real issues to talk about. How will we improve the quality of our lives? And healthcare and public health is right at the center of that. These are the things, fundamental things that I think are really important for us to be thinking about and having conversations about. The culture stuff, you can't grind away at that. But the tangible things like our access to healthcare and the quality of our food and so forth.
I know I live in the congressional district that is perennially the worst, at the very bottom of life expectancy, health outcomes. And the other county that's there at the bottom is Fresno, which is a metro county, in California. And you think, well, there's certainly some commonality between a high agricultural area there in Fresno and this coal mining region in Kentucky. And that they have a lot of common policy interests, but culturally, how do you have that conversation? How do you connect those voices in ways that they can advocate for themselves and for their kids?
Mm. Maybe the answer lies in us asking more questions of each other rather than accusing each other of being one thing and they're another. And I ask people, just look around, ask the candidates, the quality of life in where you live, in your county and in your state, that's local. And so we have to take a look at those office seekers and office holders and ask them these questions. How will you improve the quality of my life? And make them be specific. Dee, I'm telling you, if we are so fortunate to still be here 4 years from now, and even before that, I'm going to ask you back. I'm always so appreciative of your time. And when time this drops, it'll be too late. But I've registered for the Rural Assembly, the Rural Everywhere, tomorrow on August 1st. And so I'm going to show up as much as I can. You guys are an outstanding organization. If you are not a subscriber to the Daily Yonder, I'm telling you, you got to do it and you have to support their work because it really, to me, this is a big, an unpaid spokesperson endorsement here. I really do appreciate the work that you all are doing there.
Well, thank you, Michelle. It's been fun working with you and more to come.
May the force be with us, I suppose. Listen, hey, to all of our listeners, just a friendly reminder. I'm going to say it often, check your voter registration. And if you are not registered, there is no time like right now to get it done. See where you can help out locally in your local elections. These are so important. Civic engagement happens everywhere we turn. A special thanks to Bria Corsaro and Sarah Staub. I always have to say that for their great work on this podcast. And finally, be sure to subscribe to The Rural Impact on our website because that's where you're going to receive recaps from each series, a preview of what's next, our resources, and so forth. And lastly, until we meet again, please take good care of yourself and everyone around you. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you the next time on a new episode of The Rural Impact.
What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear rural? Is it agriculture, recreation, country, or maybe even elections? Rural can't be defined by one word, one place, or one population. However, we can connect the dots between rural quality of life and policy. And that's what the Rural Impact is on a mission to do. If your organization advocates for rural policies that contribute to thriving rural communities, we invite you to join our partner network. By joining us, you can tap into a wealth of resources, expertise, and a network of like-minded organizations. Discover how we can help you expand your rural reach and share your impact. Visit theruralimpact.com to connect with us. That's theruralimpact.com.